Part 3, Chapter 2, The Influence of Thought on the Body and a Practical Use of It in the Cure of Disease. To think and consciously to exist are one and the same, as was affirmed by Descartes in his celebrated proposition, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Mr. Worcester defines thought to be the exercise of the mind in any way except sense and perception. The exception here is not necessary, as neither sensation nor perception is possible without thought. I prefer the view of Descartes, followed by Hegel, that all mental action in its last analysis is a mode of thought, and it is equally certain that mental action is the only life of the body, in fact, is the highest form of vital activity. Bodily movements are the expression, or pressing outward, as the word signifies, of a mental activity which is reducible to some form of thought. Thought is universally present and underlies every act of the mind. Spinoza affirms that God is thinking being. In the philosophy of Descartes, the mind, which is an image of God, is a thinking thing. As we have said above, thought and existence are identical. We cannot love unless we love something of which we think, something that must first come into thought. We cannot remember, or imagine, or believe, or doubt, or perceive, or conceive anything that does not first become a thought. We cannot will anything, or determine upon any action, unless it is first presented to the mind as an object of thought and becomes an object of desire. We cannot desire that of which we have no pre-existing thought or idea. Take away from us the power of thought, and all mental activity and conscious life disappear with it. The body also would become sensationless and motionless, a deserted and closed temple of God in which divine service is over. This view of the relation of thought to life and existence will render intelligible what will be said as to its influence upon the bodily condition. It was a grand conception of Hegel that as God creates the world by thinking it, so it is governed and progresses according to the laws of thought or logic. This is the central idea of his philosophy of history. The same is true of the human body, which is the external world which the soul creates for its manifestation and as the theater of its activity. Its conditions of health and disease are formed by thought and governed by its laws. Physiology and pathology are a living logic. As there is a logic of events in the history of the world at large, so there is in the varying conditions of the human body the same unbending order of sequence, the same law of spiritual cause and physical effect. Ideas, which are the images and inmost reality of all created things, always tend to an external or material manifestation. If the mind forms an idea of a change in the bodily status and holds itself steadily and tenaciously to that idea, it originates, or at least intensifies, an effort of nature, that is, an unconscious action of mind, to express itself outwardly and to form the body after the pattern of the pre-existing idea. All outward things are but the exteriorization of ideas. The world, with all it contains, is only the realization, or actuality on the mental plane of sense, of God's thought, and our bodies sustain the same relation to the creating soul. If God, as an infinite spirit, creates the universe by thought, as Plato, the Apostle John, Swedenborg, Berkeley, Fichte, and Hegel all essentially agree in teaching, then thought is the primal force and the greatest power in the world. It is that from which all things exist and subsist, or have continued being. We'll have a proof of the influence and power of thought over the body in the way in which suggestion, directed to the mind respecting the action of the organs, operates upon them. Says Dr. Wilkinson, by touching the abdomen over the colon and suggesting the effect, we can, in susceptible persons, produce the results of aperient medicines and abolish constipation for years. This order of facts has an important bearing upon the origin as well as cure of disease, rendering it probable that a large number of ills come directly out of the patient's mind. For if alteration of fancy heals, this suggests that fancy first engendered the complaint. Few persons ever become aware of the influence of thought upon the body, though they see how much it has to do with our mental states. Surely, as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, is an expression of the law of our being, as an image of God. The thought of a thing is a spiritual touch or contact with it. It is an ideal and real creation of it. To think of a dishonorable act will excite a feeling of shame, which will inject the capillaries of the face with arterial blood, and a blush is suffused over the countenance. The thought of danger, either as a memory of the past, or an anticipation of the future, or even as an imaginary peril, will quicken and weaken the action of the heart. But a real danger that is not an object of thought and consciousness has no effect upon us. The sword suspended over the head of Damocles by a single hair affects him, not if he does not think of it. I knew a lady who safely passed a bridge that was undergoing repairs on horseback one dark and stormy night, and on a string piece, but who fainted on being told of it the morning after. It may be worth the trouble of inquiring if physicians do not often create, or at least greatly aggravate, the diseases of their patients by telling them of them. Where ignorance is both bliss and health, it is folly to be wise. A man may have a valvular lesion of the heart and live to be 90 years of age, if he does not know it or think of it. But the knowledge of it soon proves fatal. It may sound harsh to say it, but it is perhaps true that the shallow medical science of the young practitioner may become almost a fatal mental poison to his patient, especially if he makes an ostentatious display of it in telling of a disease of which the patient never thought before. The law of association, by which ideas become so connected together in thought that to think of one suggests or calls up the other, is one of the widest in its action and one of the most important of all the laws of mind. It is the key that unlocks many of the more mysterious phenomena of the mind, but is one of the least familiar of the mental laws, being generally overlooked by the great majority of psychologists. I know of no writer on mental science who gives to it anything like the importance that belongs to it except Mr. James Mill. It is one of the fundamental laws of thought, the influence of which is constantly felt in all forms of mental activity. Disease is often kept in thought, and consequently in existence and consciousness, by the law of association. The morbid condition becomes connected in idea with certain disagreeable sensations. Whenever these are felt, we think of the disease. And the thought of the disease calls up and brings into consciousness the unpleasant sensations, just as the sight, or thought, of a surgical instrument revives the idea of the pain it once caused us, and in a degree we feel the pain again. What we should aim at in the treatment of disease is to break up this association, this morbid concatenation of thought and sensation, and form a new one to take its place. In painful affections, a counter-irritant is sometimes employed, which, by creating a new pain or discomfort, diverts the attention from the original one and puts it out of thought and consciousness. Whatever course one may take, the thought of the disease must be supplanted by the idea of a remedy that has given and still gives relief. This association must be made equally strong with the other. The new association becomes the means of the oblivescence or forgetfulness of the disease, and in proportion as a disease is out of thought, or we become oblivious of it, it is cured. The word cure, from the Latin cura, care, implies that we no longer care for it, or in other words, we cease to think of it, or be anxious about it. In the work of James Mill, Analysis of the Phenomena of the Human Mind, it is shown, in the chapter on the will, that all action in the body is the result of the contraction of fibers, and these fibers' contractions are affected 1. By sensations, 2. By ideas. In the early period of life, all our movements are reflex, or the result of sensation, which includes what is called irritation. Of a violent muscular contraction and movement generated by sensation, we have a familiar example in sneezing. A pungent odor enters the nostrils, irritates their mucous surface, and is the occasion of a certain sensation. Immediately there follows it the spasmodic and violent action of a great number of muscles in the act called sneezing. In drinking water, if a few drops enter the larynx, the sensation occasioned by it calls into sudden action all the muscles concerned in expelling the air from the lungs, which violently contract to eject the foreign substance from them. This is the familiar movement of coughing. Hiccup is an involuntary movement of the muscles, produced by an irritative sensation in the stomach, as is often experienced after swallowing capsicum. The violent contraction of the muscles in vomiting is occasioned by a disagreeable sensation in the pharynx, or stomach. So, the action of the heart and lungs, the peristaltic motion of the alimentary canal, and the functional motion of all the organs are caused by some irritation that may be expressed by the word sensation, but of which we are not always conscious. But sensation is a mental phenomenon. It is only a conscious or unconscious thinking. Hence, Ideas as well as sensations are the cause of muscular actions in the body and have the same effect as sensations. I will give a few familiar illustrations of this. We know that a disagreeable or painful sensation, occasioned by the contact of some foreign substance with the eye, causes the eyelid to close. But if a person rapidly thrusts his finger towards the eye and near it, we cannot avoid closing it, or, as it is called, winking. Here it is not a sensation, but only the thought of one, that produces the effect. The contraction of the muscles follows the thought with as much certainty as it would the sensation if something touched the eye. This, as Mr. Mill remarks, is not a matter of conjecture, it is a matter of fact. It is an experienced event. It is important to observe that the thought is the last part of the mental operation and immediately precedes the act. This is not only a fact but a significant fact, as illustrating the power of thought as a motor force in the body. Take that curious phenomenon, which is peculiar to human nature, called laughter. It affects the whole body. It is a remarkable instance of a general muscular action and of an effect that extends through the organism, produced by thought. We laugh from a ludicrous thought or a ridiculous idea, whether spoken by others or read in a book. Sometimes, long afterwards, when the idea is by any means revived, we laugh again, even when alone. The opposite of laughter is sobbing and weeping. This also influences the whole body. The grief from which weeping springs is the effect of a certain train of ideas, and without the existence in the mind of those antecedent painful thoughts could have no place in us. Dr. Daniel Turner, a medical writer of a past age, says that the bare imagination of a purging potion has wrought such an effect in many persons as to produce a cathartic effect equal to that caused by medicine. He mentions the case of a young gentleman, a patient of his, who, having occasion to take many emetics, had such an antipathy to them that ever after he could vomit as strongly by thinking of them as most persons do by taking them into the stomach. In reading the excellent work of Dr. Tuke on the influence of the mind upon the body, we should naturally come to the conclusion that a psychical virus, in the shape of a morbid imagination, was the only cause of disease, which may not be so far from the truth, whatever may have been his aim. Nearly every disease known to medical science is shown to have been caused by it, and to have been a malady imaginaire. Professor Dick, of Edinburgh, expresses the opinion of many distinguished medical men when he says that hydrophobia in man is not the result of any poison introduced into the system, but merely the melancholy and often fatal results of panic fear. Those who are acquainted with the effects of sympathy, irritation, and panic in the production of nervous disorders will readily apprehend our meaning, and, if our view he correct, the immense importance of disabusing the public mind on the subject is apparent. Muller mentions the instance, by no means uncommon, of a person's teeth being set on edge by witnessing another about to pass a sharp instrument over glass or porcelain. Also the production of shuddering by the mere mentioning of objects which, if present, would excite that sensation. In these cases, it is simply a thought that produces the effect. Similar effects may be produced by what is called a recollective imagination. Herbert Spencer says, "I cannot think of seeing a slate rubbed with a dry sponge without there running through me the same thrill that actually seeing it produces." There are few persons who realize the important influence of our thoughts over our bodily condition. Muller has investigated this subject more fully than most physiological authors have done, and, as a condensed statement of all that he has written, he lays down the principle that the idea of a particular motion determines a current of nervous action towards the necessary muscles and gives rise to the motion independent of the will. But thought is capable of influencing the action of any organ in the body, as well as the voluntary muscles, by determining a current of nervous, or, in other words, of mental, force to it. We have in a well-authenticated fact, mentioned by Drs. Bucknell and Tuke, a case which illustrates the influence of an idea accompanied by a strong emotion and directed to a particular part of the body. A lady of intelligence, while passing a public institution, saw a child with his foot in such a position that a heavy iron gate swinging together seemed as if about to crush it. The child escaped unharmed, but the ankle of the lady became so lame that it was with difficulty she could reach home, a distance of 1/4 of a mile. The inflammation of the foot was so severe that she was confined to the bed for many days. The truth of the story is vouched for by both those intelligent physicians. This fact only exhibits, in an exaggerated degree, an influence that is at work in the generation of most chronic disorders, which are only the bodily expression of a fixed mode of thinking. But would not the same principle, that is, an idea accompanied with deep emotion and directed to a particular part of the body, act with equal efficiency in the cure of disease? There are numerous facts which show that it can, and often does, as in the case of the cures that are wrought in answer to prayer, and those effected at the tombs of saints. Facts of this kind are as well authenticated as any recorded in the history of man. But do they not give us the glimpse of a law that is worthy of investigation, and one which can be put to a practical use? If, as Iago is made by Shakespeare to say, there are things, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw our vitals, is there not in an idea a therapeutic influence of equal potency? The influence of thought, or of a change in the dominant idea, in the cure of painful affections is well illustrated by what so frequently occurs with those who are suffering from odontalgia or toothache. How often does it happen that while patients are on their way to the dentist the pain entirely disappears? The mental process of cure in these cases may be a feeling of fear of the dentist and a dread of the pain attending the extraction of the tooth. This diverts the attention, that is, the thought, from the painful tooth, and has the same effect upon it that sleep would have. Or it may be, and quite often is this: while on his way to the dentist, the sufferer feels a wish that it was not necessary. Then he begins to doubt whether the pain after all is so very bad, and becomes convinced that much of it has arisen from the exaggerating effects of impatience, and is, in fact, no worse than the operation of extracting it. By the time he reaches the office of the dreaded dentist, he has convinced himself that the tooth does not ache at all. And such is the fact, at least for the time, if not ever after. The same mental process would cure us of most, if not all, diseases. In the case mentioned, it is certainly the influence of the mind upon the body that affects the therapeutic result. It is in reality a change of thought that does all this. But is it not possible so to discipline our minds that we can, by a voluntary effort, through faith and imagination, gain relief and effect a cure in all similar cases? In the case just described, the same principle of cure is equally applicable to most diseases and painful affections. Can a good reason be given why it is not? It is not impossible that we have here, in a brief compass, the germ of a far-reaching and profound spiritual science of healing. There is no part of the human body that would seem to be more inaccessible and impervious to a mental influence than warts. A wart is defined by Dr. Mason Good as a firm, arid, harsh exuberance of the common integuments and found chiefly on the hands. Its vital connection with the body would, at first sight, appear to be but little more intimate than the clothing we wear. Yet there are many cases recorded by distinguished physicians where they have been made to disappear under the influence of the trivial, and in themselves inert, devices employed by popular superstition to remove them, and this after caustics and all other orthodox remedies have failed to exterminate them. Lord Bacon records a cure of them in his own case by one of the many means resorted to in such cases by the people, and which was recommended to him by the wife of an English ambassador, and which could have had no possible influence over them other than the tendency of an idea towards an external expression in the bodily organism, or it may have been through that mode of thought which we call faith and imagination. But both these are, or may be, voluntary acts of the mind. In so trifling a matter, we see an exhibition of one of the most important laws of our nature. The power of thought that causes the disappearance of a wart is available for the cure of a cancer, and most of the ills that flesh is heir to. For whatever, as to the bodily condition, we think to heed true, either by a spontaneous impulsion or by a tenacious, volitional effort, becomes to us a reality. This takes place not by accident or chance, but by the operation of one of the deepest laws of our being. This is not a new truth, for Solomon, by a flash of divine inspiration, 3,000 years ago, said of man, that as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Edwards, who, as is not generally known, embraced the doctrine of Bishop Berkeley as to the external world, asserts that all existence is mental, and the existence of all exterior things, including of course the human body and its varying conditions, is ideal. In accordance with this doctrine, disease becomes non-existent to the same extent in which we cease to recognize it in thought and by the will. Of the power of thought to affect the body, Mrs. Homan speaks, under the influence of an inspiration as high as that of Solomon, when she says, "Swift thoughts that came and went, like torrents o'er me sent, have shaken as a reed this thrilling frame." The most intelligent medical practitioners are beginning to realize that the mind is the most real department of our being and are coming to suspect, if not clearly to perceive, that all diseases of a so-called nervous type arise from some prior mental disturbance and are only the physical counterpart and outward expression, or pressing out, of a spiritual inharmony. By a law of correspondence, the mental abnormality records and perpetuates itself in the morbid condition of the body, which is always a creation of the mind into its own image. The mental condition of the patient is not to be viewed as a mere symptom of the bodily disorder, but as the prime element, the underlying reality, of the disease. In fact, the morbid condition of the body is symptomatic of the unsoundness of the mental state. There can be no doubt of the influence of a fixed morbid thinking in the generation of a diseased action in the bodily organs, nor of the power and importance of a sound mental activity in originating and accelerating a cure. Disease, like everything else in the universe, being a creation of thought and having no existence except in thought, or, to express it in another form, it being the materialization of an idea, it should be the aim of the physician to banish it from the thought of the patient and exile it into the region of forgetfulness. As has been said in a former part of this work, that of which we do not think has to us no existence. It is during the continuance of the obsolescence, so far as we are concerned, as good as annihilated. That of which we do not think does not come into our consciousness. There are many well-attested facts to show that men, in the ardor of battle, receive wounds of a serious nature without being aware of them until after a considerable lapse of time. We have a large amount of unsuspicious evidence of this. A pleasurable or painful sensation to which we give no attention is not felt. On this subject, Mr. James Mill remarks, "If any man tries to satisfy himself what it is to have a painful sensation and what it is to attend to it, he will find little means of distinguishing them. Having a pleasurable or painful sensation and attending to it seem not to be two things, but one and the same thing. The feeling a pain is attending to it, and attending to it is feeling it. The feeling it is not one thing, the attention another. The feeling and the attention are the same. Attention is only a concentration of thought, or, as it is sometimes called, directed consciousness. Hence, it follows that if attention and pain are one and the same, if we cease to attend to a pain, that is, to direct our thoughts to it, we cease to have it or feel it. It passes out of consciousness and out of existence. The same is true of disease and of every discomfort. Here is a most important and uniform law of our nature, and one that should never be ignored in our attempts to cure ourselves or others. It contains within it a priceless value and a sanative virtue above all that the materia medica has given to the world. It is the curative efficacy of a whole drug shop reduced to a single grain, in which there is a divine sacramental and saving potency. We have in the phenomena of dreams, when the soul crosses the imperfectly defined boundary line between this world and the spiritual realm, a striking illustration of the influence of ideas over the body. In disease, when we are dreaming, we often for the time become well. It is one of the circumstances attending dreams that our ideas or thoughts are unmixed with sensations from without. In a sound slumber, the five senses are closed. They are impervious and inaccessible to impressions from external things. But our ideas have oftentimes so much vividness as to have all the effects upon the body of sensations. Our thoughts, in fact, become internal sensations. They would do this in the waking state if our minds were equally abstracted, or in other words, if there were the same degree of inattention to surrounding things. In dreams, the invalid becomes to himself well, because ideal things and states become real things and states. It would be well for us to cultivate the faculty of dreaming ourselves into health and happiness while awake. The influence of thought in shaping the bodily condition is seen in the effects of a fixed idea. Whenever the idea of an act or a bodily state is strongly presented to the mind, there is in it a marked tendency to work itself out into a full actuality. Take as an illustration of this the act of swallowing the saliva. A friend suggests to us that we cannot refrain from doing it for the space of a minute. This presents the idea of the muscular movement so vividly to the mind that we are almost sure to do it. The tendency to work out or externalize, the idea is so strong that it overcomes the force of the will, which, in the case mentioned, is supposed to be arrayed against it. Tell a person that there is a fly, or a speck of dust, on his face, and, although there is none, and no sensation of one, yet the idea or thought immediately excites the muscles of the arm, and the act of brushing it off follows at once. Almost all persons in looking from a high tower have the thought of jumping off, and this is attended with a tendency more or less strong to do so. The man who leaped from the dome of the Capitol at Washington a few years ago probably did it from an impulse generated by the idea of it. Tell a person that he looks sick or that he has some disease, and if the idea is vividly formed in his mind and is accompanied with a degree of credence or faith, it will tend to actualize itself through an invariable law of our nature in a morbid condition of the body. The disease is the externalization of the thought, the expression, or pressing outward, of the mental state, the physical side or counterpart of the idea. All habitual mental states have their inseparable physical accompaniments. Melancholy, anxiety, impatience, remorse, and all abnormal and depressing mental conditions, with the ideas from which they spring, are invisible sculptors that fashion the body into their outward expression. Many diseases arise from a false idea, and if this is corrected, the taproot of the malady is sundered. The law of the tendency of an idea to a bodily expression works with equal efficiency in the direction of a cure, as in the generation of a diseased condition. Disease being in its spiritual root the fixedness of an idea, and its tendency to an ultimate manifestation or actuality, must be supplanted by the thought or belief of a state of health. This, by a law of correspondence, will tend to actualize itself, or express itself outwardly by an altered condition of the physical organism. In proportion as the ideas suggested by a physician are accepted and mentally appropriated by the patient, they will have their influence in modifying the bodily state. They will tend to kill or make alive. On his words hangs life or death, health or disease. They have a far higher potency than his drugs. A short time ago, I met a little girl who was suffering from toothache. I placed a finger over a branch of the fifth pair of nerves and suggested that the pain was passing away and would soon be gone. In a moment or two, the prophecy became fact, because the idea was accepted and believed. Like all ideas, it tended to a full actuality in the body. The cure, as I learned afterward, was also permanent. If a patient, as may sometimes be the case, is not in a receptive state, and our sanative idea is not transferred to him so as to become his own, if he exhibits a desire to recover, we must silently think, believe, and imagine for him, while he is passive and our hands in contact with him. Our thought will then affect him somewhat as his own thinking would, though less in degree, which he gains relief, as he probably will in a brief time. He will then accept and adopt as his own our suggested ideas, and by a subtle and potent law of our being, they will tend to a full realization in the body. Hegel says, actuality brings immediately to pass the unity of essence with existence, or of the inward with the outward. The idea as being inward tends on every hand to the outward, so that the inner and outer become one. In the tendency of an ideal state to actualize itself in the body, and to create the body into its own image, we have an almost unused power in the cure of disease. A comprehensive knowledge of this law, and a skillful employment of it as a remedial agent, and the same faith in its uniform action that we have in the law of gravitation and chemical affinity, will render a practical use of the idealistic or spiritual philosophy much more efficient in the relief and cure of disease than the prevailing materialistic systems of medication. It reaches more effectually the hidden springs of life in the body. It penetrates to the center of our being that may be impervious to the influence of a drug. The body and the soul are not two separate things, but one and the same, like cause and effect. These acts a unity. A cause is in the effect, and an effect is in its cause. This was remarked by Descartes, who refers us to two facts of consciousness to prove the unity of the soul and body. When the body receives a wound, we feel pain. The pain is in the soul principle, But without a state of unity with the body would not be felt when the physical organism is injured. So, when there is need of new material in the body to supply the place of the worn-out particles that have been ejected by the excreting organs, the soul experiences a feeling of hunger. But this mental feeling and the need of new material could not coexist unless the soul and body were a unity and acted together. So, in all languages, bodily actions are appropriated for the expression of mental energies, as in the French pincer, to think, which primarily means to weigh. To attend or give attention is primarily a stretching out, as the hand, toward a thing. All bodily actions and states are a word of which some mental energy is the spiritual meaning. So every idea in the mind tends to an actual expression in the body, so as to maintain this unity and harmony, whether it be in the genesis of a diseased condition or a state of health. If a person by some means forms the idea that a harmless tumor is a cancer, and the thought becomes fixed, nature, in order to maintain the unity of the body and the soul, actually changes the character of the tumor and transforms it into a cancer. So the idea and the fear that an affection of the respiratory organs, though it is only a slight asthma, is an incipient will, by the power of the idea alone, change it to a consumption. I have known cases where a person supposed that he had come in contact with the poison ivy, and though it was demonstrably certain that he had not, it produced all the effects of actual poisoning. Such is the wonderful force of that mode of thought we call imagination. But, as was said above, the law works with equal efficiency and energy in the direction of a cure. If in the case of the tumor the patient thinks it is harmless and is passing away, and with a divine obstinacy holds the mind steadfastly to that idea, what we call nature, that is, an ever-present, ever-active God-life in the universe, an all-pervading world spirit, goes to work to place the body in harmony and unity with the idea, and the inward becomes the outward, and the tumor disappears with a rapidity proportioned to the strength and steadfastness of the thought or belief. The reader will bear in mind that, with regard to the nature of thought, I accept and adopt the definition of Descartes, who says, "By the word thought I understand all that which so takes place in us that we of ourselves are immediately conscious of it." And, accordingly, not only to understand, to will, to imagine, but even to perceive, are the same as to think. In this sense of the term, thought and existence are identical. All action of mind or body is preceded by either conscious or unconscious thought. Thought is indeed essential to humanity. It is this that distinguishes us from the brutes. In sensation, cognition, and intellection, in our instincts and volitions, as far as they are truly human, thought is an invariable element. What is called magnetism, which has proved itself one of the most efficient means of the cure of disease, owes its efficiency to the fact that in its inmost reality it is but the sphere of our thoughts and feelings. This continually exhales from us. This subtle spiritual principle which is perpetually escaping from us forms an atmosphere around us, which is charged with the living forces of our minds. The Sanskrit word for the soul is atma, which is equivalent to the Greek atmos, vapor or air, and enters into the composition of our word atmosphere. This emanative sphere of our minds, as Swedenborg calls it, having no determinate direction, does not perceptibly act upon those around us, except in the case of those who are highly sensitive. That it can be impelled by the will, because it is only our personality diffused abroad, and is a part of our living self, and a definite direction can be given to it. The principle which sets it in motion in a given direction exists in our souls in the same way as that which communicates strength to our arm, and its nature is similar, for physical strength is wholly a spiritual force and mental energy. By a gentle impulsion of the will, we concentrate this subtle force into the hands, and through the touch, by the same volitional act, will impress it with a determinate direction to any individual or to any part of his body. By the power of thought and volition, we may direct it to a person in the same room with us, or through many miles of space, even across the Atlantic Ocean. In the human soul reside all the healing virtues and potencies that can be found in medicinal plants and minerals, for all material things correspond or answer to something in the mind. The so-called properties of matter, as has been before shown, are reducible to sensations and other modifications of our minds. Take as an illustration the oak. The English term comes from a root that signifies strength, and originally the oak meant the strong tree. In one of the names used to designate this tree in the Latin language, this idea is retained. The word rober, from which comes our term robust, means both an oak and vigorous strength. But this is not a property of any material body, but a quality and force of the mind. Line A. All the tonic virtue of this tree resides in the mind, and may be communicated to another. The same may be remarked of iron and of cinchona, so much used as tonic medicines, and of all botanic and mineral substances. Their curative properties are something in their spiritual essence, which answers to some energy of the soul. These are stored up in a healthy person, ready to be imparted and, in fact, go forth from him in the sphere of his life. Jesus the Christ referred to something like this when, after the woman, having a spirit of infirmity, had touched the fringe of his garment and was made whole. He said that he perceived virtue, or a sanative force, had gone out of him. The hand is the divinely appointed medium through which a sanative spiritual influence is communicated to another. In this way, Jesus imparted to the diseased and suffering a healing and saving virtue. On this subject, Swedenborg, more than a century ago, has said in a brief compass nearly all that can be said. According to him, the touch signifies communication, transference, and reception, because it is this in reality. The interiors of man put themselves forth by external things, especially by the touch, and thereby communicate with another and transfer themselves to another, and so far as the will is in further agreement and makes one, they are received. Whether we speak of the love or the will, it amounts to the same thing, for what is of the love of man, this also is of the will. Hence, also, it follows that the interiors of man, which are of his love, and the thought thence derived, put themselves forth by the touch, and thus communicate themselves with another, and transfer themselves into another, and so far as another loves the person or the things which the person speaks or acts, so far they are received. The practice of Jesus the Christ has given dignity to the use of the hand in the cure of disease, and the above extract contains the arcane philosophy of its efficiency, and the sum and substance of all that has been written on the subject of magnetism as a curative agency from Mesmer to Dolenza. The method of cure recommended in this volume is the plan of cure adopted and, with marvelous success, practiced 18 centuries ago by Jesus. It is the same in all its essential features as his divine method of healing through faith, and is based on his fundamental maxim that it is the spirit that maketh alive, the flesh provideth nothing. This is a complete inversion of our ordinary way of thinking and of that which prevails in the various schools of medicine, where the condition of the fleshly manifestation of man is viewed as everything in disease, and the state of the living spiritual principle is as nothing. This view of human nature I believe to be false in philosophy and deleterious to the highest well-being of humanity, when made the basis of a medical practice. It is an inversion of the divine order, for God heals the body by saving the soul. Though the spiritual physician of today has to deal with a different class of people from the simple, childlike, trusting souls who came to the Christ 1800 years ago for a cure of their maladies, yet, if his system is based upon a true philosophy of human nature, it can be made effectual today. Instead of an unthinking multitude, ready to be molded into a new mode of thinking by any superior mind, we have to deal with those who have positive ideas, and have to encounter the pride of individual opinion which is sometimes called science. Yet some of those may become in spirit as little children, and thus he receptive of the things of the kingdom of God. The man or woman who can he made to see and understand the law of our nature, by the operation of which the inward always tends to become one with the outward, ought to cooperate with the idealistic or spiritual physician in his beneficent healing endeavor, and if he is sufficiently desirous of being saved, or made whole of whatever disease he has, he will do so. If he has no desire to be healed according to this divine method, he can be left, as Jesus would have left him, to go his own way.